In 1973, a man named Jan Erik Olsson attempted to rob a bank in Stockholm, Sweden. And later, he demanded that his jailmate, Clark Olofsson, join him, which he did. He eventually joined him in the heist, and together they held four employees hostage for 6 days in the bank vault. And only a year later, in Berkeley, California, a 19-year-old heiress named Patty Hearst was taken captive by the Symbionese Liberation Army, or SLA for short, until her eventual release. Something crazy happened in both of these cases. In terms of the robbery in Sweden, the police chief was actually allowed to enter the building on day two just to check on the health of the hostages that were there. And he noticed that the hostages were extremely hostile towards him, but seemed to be really relaxed and playful and having fun with their captors. The police chief actually said that he didn't believe that the gunman would hurt them because they had created this kind of strange relationship with one another. And later, they figured out that he was right. On the last day of the heist, the police threw tear gas into the vault and were able to get the captors, Olson and Olofsson, to surrender. At this point, the police asked the hostages to come out first, but they refused because they thought that if they come out first, that they would gun down Olson and Olofsson, which they didn't want. And then when the police came in to take the hostages away, the hostages and their captors started to embrace, they started to hug one another. The hostages were screaming at the police not to hurt them. And one of the hostages even grabbed, I think it was Olofsson's hand, and said to him, "I'll see you again." It even got to the point where the police started to investigate one of the hostages because they thought this relationship that they had with the captor meant that they somehow were involved with planning this heist. And I know some of the situation in terms of the police and the hostages and them being able to come in and all of that seems kind of crazy based on how those things go today. But just as a note, police negotiation wasn't really invented until sometime in the 70s, and it wasn't really consistently used or perfected until the end of the 1970s. So by this time, they really had no idea how to manage a situation like this. Moving on to then Patty Hearst, only about 10 weeks later after she was released, she then goes on to completely denounce her family and claim her allegiance to the SLA, which was the exact same organization that kidnapped her. She changed her name to Tanya and then even committed a couple robberies with them. She was actually arrested in 1975 for this, but the public opinion was really split on what to do with her. A lot of people thought that she wasn't really in her right mind when this happened, so she couldn't really be at fault. And that was actually her defense lawyer's defense, that she was brainwashed. She was supposed to get 7 years in prison, but President Jimmy Carter commuted her sentence to 4 years, and then eventually President Bill Clinton actually pardoned her. So, what happened in these cases, and how and why could this possibly happen to you or someone you know in the future? So, hi, everybody. For those that don't know me, my name is Sabrina. I'm a clinical psychologist, and on this channel, I talk about psychology as we see it, popular Netflix series and films. You do not have to be a fan of any of the series that I talk about in order to watch my videos, because I'll always give a brief recap here. And today we are talking about one of my absolute favorite series, which is Money Heist. In its original language, it's Spanish. I believe it's called La Casa del Papel. I obviously don't speak Spanish, so I don't know. And if you haven't seen at least a few episodes into season three, then there will be some spoilers in this video. So if you plan to watch, just put this in your save for later. And if you haven't seen Money Heist, then you better plan to watch it because it's incredible. So, how the premise of the show begins is with a couple of thieves that plan to rob the Royal Mint of Spain. Now, there are pockets of this group that know each other, but the only person that knows all of them is known as the Professor. And he collects this group of people that have special skills to commit this heist. And throughout, just to help with anonymity, so it doesn't muddy the waters of what they're trying to do, one of the rules is no names. And so they decide on using names of cities, which is how we get people like Tokyo or Berlin or Nairobi or Rio. So they go into the Royal Mint and we see a couple people that are already working there. Of some of the employees, we have a secretary named Monica and her boss Arturo. We found out pretty early that they were sleeping together and she is actually pregnant by him, which he does not take well. And then they come in. At a certain point during the heist, Arturo tells Monica that he actually has a spare cell phone in his jacket pocket because, of course, they took all their other phones at the beginning of this heist. And so she is somehow able to get this phone, even with one of the gang there. I forget if this one's Oslo or Helsinki, one of the two. But then later runs into Berlin and Denver. And as she's walking away, the phone goes off. And so Berlin takes the phone and then he orders Denver to kill him. Because for the heist, Berlin is picked as the leader to kind of execute the rules of the professor while they're actually in the bank. So Denver takes Monica to the bathroom and he can't do it. He fires around, but he doesn't actually shoot at her. She lets him know there's a bank vault that she has access to that she can put herself in. That way they can pretend that she actually died and hid her body. So then she agrees to be shot in the leg. That way it can look like there's enough blood for when Berlin comes in and actually thinks that she's dead. That plan works. She goes down to the vault. Denver's the only one that knows that she's there, so he has to sneak away every now and again to like feed her, care for her wound. And at some point, they eventually get to some kind of relationship. They end up kissing, they end up doing even more than that. And the crazy part of this is that eventually they end up having a child together, and then she later joins their operations as Stockholm. A perfect name based on what happened in Stockholm, Sweden, that I talked about at the beginning of this. And this would sound almost too crazy to be real if I didn't just tell you that the exact same thing happened to a real life person in Pattyhurst. So we're going to talk about what Stockholm Syndrome is and how the heck this can actually happen. So, what is it? It's a psychological response that happens when a person starts to feel, well, a hostage, not just a person, starts to feel positive feelings. So, feelings of empathy or loyalty or affection towards their captor. So, this is important because it's not just romantic feelings. So, a lot of the ways it's depicted in media is that a person falls in love with their captor. It's not just that, it can be loyalty or other feelings as well. And I want to start this video right away from a point of empathy. It can be easy to listen to everything that I'm about to say to you and say, these people are crazy. Like, how in the world could they do that? I would never do something like that if I was in that situation. The thing is, Stockholm Syndrome can be thought of as like a coping strategy, a way to reduce cognitive dissonance that can exist in our brains when we are held captive. Now, I talked about this in a prior video, but I'll do a refresher here in case you hadn't heard it in terms of what cognitive dissonance is. So, what this is saying is basically that our brain cannot hold two opposing viewpoints at the same time. So, what it does is it literally forces us to try to reduce that dissonance. So, either we stick with our original thoughts and we ignore all the information to the contrary, or we change our minds. So, in the case of a person with Stockholm Syndrome, what their brain does is makes them emotionally attached to their captor. So their new thought might be, okay, well, this person is hurting me, but not as much as they could, which means that they actually do care about my survival because they don't want to hurt me to the point of death. And more on that last point later. But let's not rag on these people because their brains is making them deal with the situation in a different way than maybe our brains would. Now, let's jump into some statistics. The FBI estimates that about 8% of people who are in some kind of hostage situation will go on to develop Stockholm Syndrome. Now, I know that that might seem like kind of a high percentage because there are 8 billion people in this world, but the FBI only looked at statistics of people who are in real life hostage kidnapping situations. So things like bank robberies or plane hijackings. These aren't the only cases where Stockholm Syndrome has been looked at, though. Today, this can be expanded to things like abusive relationships or even cults, where participation in these two things, these two captors, can psychologically and sometimes physically hold you captive. But there's a debate on whether this application of the term is appropriate. And because of such great debate on this, you actually couldn't be diagnosed with Stockholm Syndrome by somebody like myself. It isn't in any of our diagnostic manuals. The reason for some of this debate is that it's not entirely uncommon for the captives, so the hostages, to react negatively to police or authorities after they're rescued, or even during the process of trying to rescue them, like we see with the people in the bank robbery in Sweden when the police chief came in and they were acting hostile towards him. In that case of the Stockholm bank robbery, it took the police 6 days to rescue them. But there have been recorded cases where it's taken them 2 weeks or many months or even years to rescue certain hostages from these hostage situations. So, although they might eventually be safe and definitely have something to be grateful to those authorities that helped with that, they can rightfully be upset about the pace of these negotiations and how long it took for these people to actually free them. But this alone doesn't mean a person is developing Stockholm Syndrome. So, what actually goes into developing this, and how could a person like Monica in Money Heist morph into Stockholm and become a Patty Hearst in her own right? There are five main factors that contribute to the development of Stockholm Syndrome. And along the way, I'll be talking about examples from true hostage situations, things like bank robberies, but also some examples from like abusive relationships, for instance, since there is that debate on whether this counts or not. The first factor is there has to be a perceived threat to their survival. The captor is the one with all the power in this sense, and the victim is really highly attuned to this. And as a result, they become really highly attuned and aware to their behaviors and how their own behaviors could impact their survival. And this threat doesn't even have to be constant. And actually, if it's an inconsistent threat, that then makes the hostage, the victim, more psychologically dependent on the captor. So thinking of Money Heist, the people that are in this, they all have assault rifles. Like they have the physical means to end these people's lives. And there's certain points where they actually overhear some of the folks, like Berlin, for instance, threatening to off some of them. And then throughout the show, they're constantly showing the hostages their faces, which is no bueno in general, because often what this means is that when the situation's over, this person is going to off you because you could go to the police and you could give them a description of what this person looks like to easily identify you. You can pick them out of a lineup, etc. So there's a lot of elements to have these people feel like there is a real perceived threat to their safety. Thinking about abusive relationships, not exclusively men, but especially for when men are the abusers for women. Typically, men are stronger than women, and so it is possible to beat someone to death. And so if a man is physically harming a woman, there could be a real threat to her survival to where he could physically end her life and she would not be able to fight back. And if an abuser is, say, the primary breadwinner, there is a real threat if that person leaves you, if you leave them, if they get arrested, for instance, because now you're on your own and you have no money to pay for things like food to actually help you to survive. So that can be another way where there's kind of like a perceived threat. The second factor that can go into development of Stockholm syndrome is the captor showing some kinds of small acts of kindness. Now, it doesn't have to be consistent by any means, but when the captor shows any form of kindness, it feels disproportionately meaningful to those hostages, the captives, in that moment. Think, for instance, a captor giving a hostage food. Like, you get 3 meals per day in prisons. Like, this is not a kind act by any means, but in that situation where you feel like your survival is at risk, that feels like the kindest act in the world and can really make you think, you know what? This person isn't all bad. Like you can start to actually humanize them and even start to have sympathy for your captor. Thinking about in Money Heist, a good example of this is when Denver doesn't shoot Monica. He was told to kill her, and instead he spares her life, which is an act of kindness in that moment, but it's really, when we think about it, it's kind of a withholding of some kind of violence, not an adding of something kind, which that itself could be its own small act of kindness, where I didn't do something that I could have, right? I only shot you in the leg when I could have shot you in the head. And especially for abusive relationships, this is a big one. So if somebody is being physically abused and a person usually abuses them pretty badly, maybe it's the point where there's, blackouts, a lot of bruises, etc. But one day they just, and I'm for people that might just be listening to this video, I'm using heavy quotation marks. one day they just maybe hit them a few times. This can be looked at as an act of kindness because they're restraining. Like the person knows, oh, they could have done a lot more to me, but they decided not to. So even like the withholding of some kind of violence that they might be used to can be seen as a kind act. But there are some real life examples of the captors doing actual actions that might show some kindness. So, for example, with the bank robbery at Stockholm, Sweden, there was a moment, and it was recorded that Olsen, one of the captors, that there was a hostage that was cold and was shivering, and so he actually put his jacket on her. Or another hostage, there was one point where they had a bad dream, so he was soothing her. Or another person where for some reason they were allowed their phones. I think they were there watching them, but they were allowed their phones and they were trying to contact their family to just kind of check in and say how they're doing, like say that they're okay. And they weren't able to get connection, probably because they're sitting in a bank vault. And one of the captors was encouraging them, saying, "Don't give up, just try again, you can get them." And the same thing actually happens in Sweden that we see in Money Heist, in which Olsen, one of the captors, actually wanted to shoot one of the hostages in the leg to shake things up with the police to kind of get things going. He didn't end up doing this, but a lot of the hostages were even encouraging that one hostage should just kind of take the bullet. And then the hostage who almost got shot said these actual words: "How kind I thought he was for saying it was just my leg he would shoot." I mean, let that sink in, right? Like you were just doing your job at this bank. This person came in to rob it, and then you're saying it's a kindness that they didn't shoot me in the leg. The third factor is isolation from the outside world, if it's a hostage situation, or just isolation from other people in general, if it's in like abusive relationships. This is a classic cult move, right? To isolate you from family, all those people, and what this does is that you don't have these other perspectives. And when we're really in the thick of and in the midst of a situation, it can be extremely hard for us to see it clearly. So it can be really helpful for other people to be like, "You are tripping. Why are you falling for this captor when they're doing XYZ?" It might be hard for us to come to that realization. And there's no one to talk us out of how we're feeling. It only becomes that captor now that they're our sole source of social connection, of information, because you have no clue what's going on in the world outside, etc. The fourth factor is the length of captivity or control in the case of abusive relationships. So, the longer the captivity or control, the more likely to form an emotional bond, and the more likely to develop than Stockholm Syndrome. This is usually the brain's way of trying to survive, and there might be points where you might have just completely given up on escaping and you're just trying to adjust to this new life as you know it. This is incredibly common with somewhat older children who are kidnapped by other people. So, children who are old enough at least to remember their former family, in the first few hours or few days, they might be crying a lot, saying they want to go back to their family. Maybe that person usually is trying to change their name to hide their identity, and they say, "No, my name is this, it's not that." But over time, unfortunately, a lot of these kids, when the cops aren't coming for them and their parents haven't come back to get them through no fault of their own because they don't know where they are, they give up and say, "Okay, this is my life now. I have to get used to this hell that I'm living in." Now, it doesn't always have to be a longer length of time. In the case of the Stockholm incident, it lasted 6 days, and after around day two, they'd already started the bonding process. And in Money Heist, we see with Monica slash Stockholm that after just a few days, maybe it was even 2 days, similarly like that, she kind of started forming that relationship with Denver. So it doesn't always have to be longer, but that just makes it more likely. And the fifth and final factor that can go into developing Stockholm syndrome is some kind of power imbalance being present, right? In that situation, the captor has all the power, all the dominance, and that can make the victim feel extremely helpless. So doing something to kind of get on their good side could, one, help ensure their survival, but also could be a way to kind of regain some kind of control in that situation. And a lot of times, which ends up being right, they might do this because they feel like, okay, the captor is less likely to harm me if we have some kind of good relationship. Maybe I'll get more freedoms because of this, etc. And basically, what this looks like in real life is just kind of giving into the demands of that abuser, of the captor. So, if they're trying to cut you off from your friends, for instance, and every time that you hang out with your friends, if you come home and this person physically or verbally abuses you, then over time, when you don't do that, and then they in turn don't do those actions, it could feel like, okay, you know what? It's better if I just do what they're saying because I won't get harmed because of it. And maybe they'll actually treat me better, which is horribly sad. So honestly, I think Money Heist did a pretty good job at showing Stockholm Syndrome in Monica. I mean, she's in a situation where she's experiencing extreme fear. She doesn't really see a way out, especially when she gets caught with that phone. Then she really doesn't see a way out. Then, because of Denver saving her, she begins to see him as some kind of protector from other threats. Like, one, he didn't harm me, but also he protected me from Berlin, who is the real bad guy because he told him to harm me, but Denver didn't. And then she could start blaming external factors instead of actually blaming Denver for certain things. So her maybe saying, "Oh, well, I mean, he had to shoot me in the leg because he had to try to convince other people I was dead. There needed to be blood there, so he had to do what he had to do." Then to top it off, he locks her in a vault where only he knows that she's there. So she has to rely on him for food, for changing her wound and making sure that she gets better, for general entertainment, and then for fulfilling other needs that she may have. So why in the world would she side with the police when they have done nothing for her up until this point?
Monica, you do realize I'm holding you against your will, right? You have a syndrome.
What? What syndrome?
From Stockholm. You fall in love with the son of a bitch that kidnaps you. You're losing your mind in here, Monica, treating me like I'm your boyfriend. Doctors say it's a psychological thing.
Listen, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard in my life.
Of course you'd say that. You've got the syndrome.